Welcome everybody to this meeting, and a special welcome to our speakers, Carina Davidson and Anthony Forsyth. This is the first event in our spring series on the future of worker power. My name's Jeff McCracken-Hewson, and I'm the events lead for Australian Fabians Victorian Branch. Now, in the spirit of reconciliation, Australian Fabians acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Now, some details about the meeting, just to let you know, we'll be taking questions to our speakers via Zoom chat. You can submit questions or comments for that matter. You can submit chats at any time, and we will attempt to pick out questioners who have asked questions that reflect the main themes that emerge from the chat. Another thing is to tell you is that after the formal meeting tonight, you're all invited to get yourself a drink and some nibbles and join us in the online pub, and more details on that when we get to it. Now, over the last 4 or 5 decades, I think, as we all know, we've seen a significant shift in the balance of power from workers to the bosses. In other words, to the people who own and direct capital. And in that period, the share of economic output going to workers has declined significantly, so in many cases have their conditions of work. The failures of these decades in which neoliberalism has ruled are now becoming more and more apparent to everybody. So this now ought to be the moment when the pendulum starts to swing back. But is it doing that? And more to the point, how can we as a progressive movement ensure that it does? What can be done by the organisations that represent workers and by the movement as a whole? And these are the questions that we're asking in this series. And we're looking at it in 3 areas. So tonight, in this first event of 3, we're looking at organised labour and industrial action. We're looking at workers' power over their incomes and their conditions of work, typically exercised through their trade unions. In event 2, we're looking at industrial policy, that is the power of workers to influence the kind of work that is available to them in Australia. So if we don't want to have an entire workforce that's out there delivering pizzas, but is doing something that is potentially more satisfying, what do we need to be doing as a movement? And in the third event, we're looking at the question of industrial democracy. How can workers increase their power over the conduct and the governance of the enterprises and the organisations that they work in? So to help us through tonight's topic, we are lucky to have 2 outstanding speakers who've distinguished themselves both in the practical struggle of workers and in thinking about the whole issue of worker power. And our first speaker that I'd like to introduce is Carina Garland. Carina is an Assistant Secretary at the Victorian Trades Hall Council. She's an outstanding campaigner for Australian workers, and she really gets stuck in on the issues that matter. And recently, among other things, she's been out there campaigning on wage theft, on migrant workers, on the injustices of job seeker, and so on. Before now, she's been a communications officer at the NUW. She's been an electorate officer, and she's also been a lecturer at Sydney University. So welcome, Carina.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here. That's such a kind introduction. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all respectively meeting tonight and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. This land was stolen, never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Comrades, by opening to, I should really start by saying I'm an enormous optimist. So that anything I say tonight will probably be, trying to find some hope in what I think is, a bit of a challenging time for all of us right now. And I think really importantly, as Jeff, you mentioned in your introduction, it's important that we situate where we are now in the context of decades of neoliberalism that created conditions that made it much harder for working people to organise themselves in their workplaces and to take action. I think that right now what we're seeing in this public health crisis, and I know that not everyone is from Victoria necessarily on this call, but I know that certainly the conversation in Victoria around the public health emergency has been around how we think about new ways of working and particularly how we address insecure work. The pandemic hasn't created the problems of insecure work and of unemployment and of, the marginalisation of migrant communities, but it has really brought those existing problems and inequalities to the public's attention. So it's probably a really good time for us to have a public conversation about what we can do to address a lot of these issues, since I don't think the public appetite for conversation and debate around the things that matter to us as a labour movement have ever been so great. So really we've seen insecure work, the failure to value migrant workers in our communities, the results of economic policies from decades that have driven inequality, being, very much felt across the state and across the country. We've seen the outcomes of insecure, unaffordable housing policies, a lack of public housing in Victoria and a lack of quality public housing, creating a lot of problems in this public health crisis, an industrial relations legislation regime that's outdated, and really, I think, and this is something I'm particularly interested in, a lack of really imaginative and interventionist industrial policies that drive good, secure union jobs. And I think on that last point, I'm sure a lot of us were pretty horrified, maybe not shocked, unfortunately, to hear the announcement from Qantas that they are in the midst of outsourcing thousands of jobs, despite receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in government support. So really, we shouldn't allow that sort of thing to happen as a country or even within our states. Public money should mean secure jobs for our communities. So I think all the drivers that I've sort of spoken about and the issues that I just mentioned that are most starkly evident right now in a public health emergency are all interconnected, and they're all manifestations really of, as Jeff sort of flagged in his introduction, of a neoliberal way of thinking. And I think it's probably no surprise that Josh Frydenberg looked to Margaret Thatcher and, as a role model, and has been very public in his adoration of her, but that feels very weird and stubborn in this particular moment, and a real misread, I think, and again, this is probably my optimism coming out, of what community sentiment is. We've got someone being praised and idolised that famously said there's no such thing as a society. She decimated work communities, unions, and worked really hard to dismantle the social safety net. But I wonder if any leader would dare say something like that now. I wonder if Josh Frydenberg would dare say something like that now. Even looking at Boris Johnson in the UK, he was very quick to initiate social safety net programs when it was really clear that the COVID crisis was causing a lot of damage to society. The wage subsidy was introduced in the UK before JobKeeper was introduced in Australia. Even Boris Johnson, as much as it pains me to say, had a pretty good understanding of what was required at this moment of crisis. A statement like Thatcher's "there's no such thing as a society" is really at odds with what we're being told from our government, which is that we're all in this together, and it's only through acting collectively that we're going to get through this crisis, both in terms of the health outcomes and the economic outcomes. neither of which can really be separated. So I think it's really important that we are encouraged by the fact that a collective approach is really the way governments and a lot of sectors of society, the media included, are talking about how we move through where we're at right now, because I think it gives us a sense of momentum that we can really push for some change right now. As I said, we are really experiencing now most sharply the horrible effects of neoliberalism. Really the things that have tried to destroy institutions that were around the collective good. And I think not only can we try and repair that damage in this moment and as we move through the public health crisis, but to try and rebuild something better. And a lot of people have written already a lot of things about what that might look like. So I think, critically, one of the issues here is how do we address high unemployment, which is, obviously increased, and we'll probably see higher figures than we've already seen as we move through the next few months. How do we address casualisation, which, as Premier Daniel Andrews himself has said, insecure work is toxic. How do we address that? And how do we address low union density? I think it's a pretty simple proposition in terms of one of the things we can do, which is demand good jobs. In Australia, but not just in Australia, I think it's been documented by a range of different people, including Robert Reich, that there's been a move away from interventionist industrial policies. And I think we need to take this opportunity to change that. So speaking from Victoria, the state government is in the process of developing something called a Fair Jobs Code. And that really is, for the first time, a pretty strong set of guidelines that really demand that for public money spent, there should be public benefit gained through the creation of good, secure jobs. So that will come into effect through a range of different grants administered by the state government, as well as big build projects. But we also need to think about how we can invest and create good, secure jobs in places where there have been probably, historically and traditionally marginalised groups of people. So what does supporting social infrastructure in a framework that demands spending on good, secure jobs look like, which are, tend to be service and care industries that are highly feminised industries? How can some of these mechanisms not just create good jobs and direct employment, but how can they also do things like address the gender pay gap, for instance? How can we create better training pathways for people, and particularly young people? We know, and this is both, from our previous experience of recessions, but also research that's happening right now, that it generally takes around a decade for people under 30 to recover from an event like the one we're experiencing now. And the Mitchell Institute's research has suggested that it'll take about 8 years for our apprenticeships to get back to where they were pre-corona crisis. And so we really need to think about what sorts of interventions can be made at a state level to try and ensure that there are genuine opportunities for young people to access good training and great jobs. And it's really encouraging to see as well that part of the ACTU jobs plan is really to invest in 150,000 apprenticeships across Australia. And I think, the challenge for us all, unfortunately, at a federal level, is an ideological one. We know how hard we all had to collectively work as a movement to push Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg and the whole government to accepting the fact that there was a really strong case for a wage subsidy. And that became JobKeeper, of course. Now, unfortunately, JobKeeper excluded casual workers who had service of less than 12 months and migrant workers. And that amounted to millions of Australian workers being excluded from that scheme. So, it wasn't good enough. But we know that it was also a very difficult battle to even get to what we had. So, you know, trying to get a jobs plan from this government is going to be a big challenge. And I think a lot of this work is going to be really up to how the community is able to be shifted on a lot of the issues that matter, like the importance of job creation and the importance of direct, permanent, secure job creation. And I think that a lot of the community would probably be with us on the need for that, because we've seen firsthand the terrible effects on communities and health when we have economies built effectively on the backs of the labour of insecure workers. You know, I know there's also been talk of job guarantees in the labour movement and amongst academics as well, either targeted programs, so ones that would look at young workers specifically, or more broad-based. I know there's been some commentary on that is effectively, you know, a hyper work for the dole scheme, but I don't think it actually needs to be that. I think we just really need to demand good, secure jobs people can build their lives around. It's a pretty simple concept, and it feels kind of weird coming up with a solution or thinking that a solution to a set of, you know, complex issues that neoliberalism has created is really as basic as just give people good, secure jobs and have a good social safety net. But I actually think that's kind of really what would make a big difference to people's lives. You know, I think that it's no coincidence that there is a relationship between the decline of good full-time jobs and union membership and good well-paid jobs and union membership. There are challenges in trying to organise casual workers. The bargaining system doesn't work equally for all workers in this country, you know, particularly when you've got labour hire workers engaged for a company. They might work every day at the work site of company X, but you know, they are actually engaged through the labour hire company Y. So they're never able to actually directly bargain with the people that they're working with every single day. And, you know, the Federal Labor Party in last year's election came up with a series of policies that would work to address those issues, but obviously there was no change in government last year, and therefore, as the ACTU campaign went, no changing of the rules. So I think, you know, in terms of trying to be hopeful and optimistic about those rules and what we can kind of do to try and shift the regulatory frameworks, I guess, you know, we have to, again, win the community over on this, and that depends on all of us in the labour movement of making really strong arguments and shifting the crowd in terms of the need for a change in regulation. I think, you know, unfortunately, this public health crisis has really given an opportunity to employers too, and you know, industry groups to try and make arguments around further, you know, flexibility / insecurity in workplaces across the country. We do need to rebalance things in favour of workers, because it is too difficult for workers to be organised into unions. We know that it is really hard for a union to walk into a lunchroom at a factory and get people to join the union, or to check to make sure people have been paid properly. So I think that, you know, we don't have a very good environment in Canberra, unfortunately, to change some of the legislation that needs to be changed. Equally, you know, there needs to be more compliance with laws. The fact that wage theft has exploded in the way it has, and entire industries such as hospitality have been built on that, is a disgrace. Again, if we had the capacity to enter workplaces and check payrolls, you know, that would go some way in intervening before things got really bad, or at least to be able to collectivise around those issues that are experienced in workplaces where employers really do seek to get away with unlawful and absolutely outrageous behaviour. So, you know, I think that, you know, obviously industrial action is one of the most important things that any worker can do in this country, because it really is the expression of worker power. And it's far too limited in this country. And I think that the fragmentation of the workforce and the casualisation and the way that there is risk shifted to outsourced, arrangements to labour hire has really been a deliberate part of trying to weaken union power, trying to weaken the capacity for workers to take action. Lawfully, it's really difficult still to take industrial action. It's only possible, when it's only possible really when you're bargaining with an employer. However, there are a range of campaigns that I think we can look to, again, this is me being an optimist, to show that there are ways for worker to take action that aren't just about bargaining, that are really worthy. And I want to look at a couple of recent examples. So we can look at what happened, particularly in Victoria, through the work of the Young Worker Centre at Victorian Trades Hall Council, but also I think as well through work that's been done in a range of other states through their trades and labour councils to counter wage theft, where workers have effectively, come together and have, basically caused scenes outside of employers that have refused to pay them lawfully. We've seen this be really effective on shining a light into the practices of George Columbaris's Maid Group and the terrible wage theft stories that were coming out of there. Those kinds of actions are really creative. They are not about bargaining, but they are about workers taking the power that they have and exercising that to get some kind of justice. And so I think that is really positive to see. Recently too, when JobKeeper was introduced, we just had an awful sense that there would probably be employers that would seek to find loopholes and exclude people from that at Tradesforce. So we set up a website called Job Scammer, where workers could tell their stories, ask questions around whether their exclusion or certain things employers were telling them were okay. So, I mean, there were a range of stories here. Like in some cases, we had workplaces saying, look, they'll put us on JobKeeper, but they're not going to pay us anything until October. Is that okay? So really, people really trying to push the limits of what was allowed with their employees. And we got justice for a lot of those workers through things like writing letters, having meetings, but also we saw workers actually take collective action for the first time. So there's some ongoing work with General Pants Company, a big retailer at the moment, with young workers who through the Job Scammer website came together and unionised to fight against their large employer who was seeking to exclude them from JobKeeper. And the reasons given for that were really that they might have taken a few weeks off over the course of several years of casual employment. So therefore they weren't eligible because of the strange 12-month rule that the government has imposed in terms of eligibility for JobKeeper. That's been questioned in the past with a number of employers, that sort of weird definition of ongoing systematic employment. And the fact as well that we can actually have ongoing casuals in such a way for over 12 months doing regular hours, effectively de facto full-time or part-time employees, is in itself its own issue. But we've had some success there with workers in a range of workplaces, including Dimics, so another recognisable name, unionising, taking action, whether that's through petitions, whether that's through doing activities online, because of course we're prevented in terms of what we can do physically right now, and that's been really promising. Also in terms of occupational health and safety, frames and concerns, we've seen that the United Workers Union take action in a number of workplaces on that right now, including at Spotless Laundries and at Woolworths warehouses, and again having some wins there. So I think that obviously we don't want legislatively industrial action to be limited to bargaining and so bureaucratic, but I think even despite all of those limitations, we've seen some workers do some pretty creative things to win justice through taking action. And I think, all the political, the social and the industrial, all of these actions are interconnected. And I think that, really for us collectively to get the sorts of changes that would genuinely make workers' lives for the better, we actually need to I think continue to build a really big movement of people that maybe haven't had much to do with the union movement before, but would absolutely care about our issues. So joining them up to the union if they're in work. If they're not in work, I know that there's the Unemployed Workers Union, as well as a number of other organisations that people can join to be part of a movement really that seeks to improve the lives of ordinary people. And I think, just really finally to sort of touch on, whilst we do a lot of work with people in unions around their issues at work, the issues people have outside of work are equally important to workers. So, thinking around the health crisis right now, and in particular aged care. So a really big campaign that we ran through VTHC during the last state election campaign was for aged care ratios. And, at a state level, in our public system, there has been certain changes made over the years. But I think we're really seeing right now how important for both workers' lives and for the lives of people workers care about, their parents in these places, those changes are really important. So I think as well, we shouldn't limit the way we kind of campaign and think of ourselves as unions to simply the industrial. It is about more than that. I mean, we wouldn't have Medicare if it weren't for unions. We wouldn't have dignity in retirement through superannuation if it weren't for unions. We wouldn't have the 8-hour day. We wouldn't have weekends. We wouldn't have the concept of leisure if it weren't for working people fighting for those things through their unions. So I think industrial action is always important. But, I think that we take industrial action, not just, for the bread, but for roses too, as, the song very beautifully says. So I think that's it from me. I think that really this moment is a bit of a call to arms for all of us who, care about organised labour, about, building a better country. And I think there's a lot of challenges, but I think collectively we can rise to them.
Thanks very much, Carina. And it's wonderful to hear an optimist. We need to be optimists. We need to sort of say, yeah, this is our moment, and we're going to seize it, and we're going to be successful. And I think with people like you in the leadership, I'm sure we will be. There's a very interesting, perspective, I think, that you gave on things there, to really take a broad view of this issue. So that's really, really useful. Thanks very much. Our second speaker today is Anthony Forsyth. Anthony is a professor in the Graduate School of Business and Law at RMIT. He is the founder of the blog Labour Law Down Under, which is very prolific, and there's tons of fabulous material actually on that blog if people would like to explore it. And he specialises in collective bargaining, in the regulation of trade unions, and worker exploitation. So he's a pretty good authority for what we're talking about tonight. He's written extensively on the future of unions, and he has a book coming out which will explore how unions and collective worker representation are responding to neoliberalism and to the fishering of work, as he puts it. So welcome, Anthony.
Thanks very much, Jeff, for the introduction and for the invitation. I can't tell you how many Fabian Society events I organised back at university, so it's good to come full circle and be invited to speak at one after all these years, and also great to share the virtual stage with Carina, whose work I admire and respect greatly, and everything you're doing at Trades Hall. The talk I'm going to give will be quite different to Carina's, I think, because I'm a researcher. Hopefully a fairly practically engaged one, very interested in the issues around, what is the future of organised labour. Before I get more into it, I also want to respectfully acknowledge the people of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of RMIT University. So I'll start with this. Professor Jelle Visser wrote a paper for the ILO last year called Trade Unions in the Balance. And he outlined 4 possible futures for unions. And Jelle Visser's, a renowned monitorer of the fate of unions and union decline and collective bargaining coverage all over the world. He's kind of the maestro of this area across all the data. And so the 4 options or possible futures he outlined were, firstly, gradual marginalisation, that there'd be continuing membership decline and reduction in union power. Secondly, dualisation of union representation. So unions will defend and resist where they're strong, but non-union workplaces where unions are weak will get bigger. The third option, replacement, that unions give way to other forms of social action and representation, including employer-driven union substitutes. And the fourth, the optimistic one, revitalisation, that unions regain vitality, that they expand beyond their current membership base, and that they organise in difficult areas through innovative digital tools. And I firmly believe option 4 is possible. But for that to happen, a lot depends on how much unions are willing to adapt to the realities of the modern world of work and a lot of the changes that have occurred in what work looks like, what workplaces look like, and how businesses are structured. So how have we got to this point? How have unions been beaten down over the last 30 years? And there's a great book that takes that title, Beaten Down and Worked Up, by Stephen Greenhouse, former New York Times Labour journalist, which came out last year, which the title's a bit of a downer, but it's actually a really good book on some of the recent successes in the US, the heartland of union busting. But what have we seen happen? We all know this: relentless employer hostility, the state enabling this through anti-union laws and things like the waterfront dispute. New business models. Carina mentioned labour hire, which I looked at for the Victorian government a few years ago, that enable employers to distance themselves from any responsibility for the workforce, but more than that, step away from having to deal with unions, casualisation and other forms of insecure work. And the latest scam that I'm looking at quite closely in some of the work I'm doing, the gig economy. So what an audacious inversion of the conventional approach to employment regulation that these platforms like Uber and Deliveroo use. So we normally say, as a starting assumption, that if you provide your labour, the law provides you with basic protections. Well, these outfits have turned that on its head and said, you're a contractor, prove otherwise if you want to be covered by an award or get a minimum wage. So I think with all of that that's gone on, the traditional strategy of bargaining for better conditions with a static employing business can't on its own be relied upon to deliver outcomes for workers. What we've got is, or what we've had is businesses morphing into franchise structures and supply chains. And while that's happened, the Fair Work Act requires unions to bargain enterprise by enterprise. And within that limited framework, the window for protected industrial action shrinks even smaller. Now, this was what the Change the Rules campaign of the ACTU leading up to the last election was all about. And I agree that there are fundamental weaknesses in our labour laws that have to be fixed. And I can talk a bit more about that later if people are interested in questions. But what I would say also is that even with the strongest legal support for bargaining and the right to strike, unions still have to persuade a group of workers that it's in their interest to take on their employer. They still have to sell the proposition that being a union member is worth it. And in that discussion, we now throw in the massive disruption caused by the pandemic. And I think this for unions is both a blessing and a curse. The positive side is that the need for unions, the value of collectivism, it's never been more obvious than in this current situation we're in. You know, when an organiser is the only thing standing between you and a manager directing you to keep working, despite the obvious risk of infection, well then unionism, whether you form a collective and be part of it, is a matter of life and death. And the stop works Carina mentioned by the UWU at Spotless and some of the DCs around Melbourne, they've really shown that workers, low paid, vulnerable, often migrant workers, they will take industrial action when their most basic right to safety is threatened. The downside of the pandemic, as I see it, is that it's forcing unions into a mostly defensive position. That's because of the economic impact, the rising unemployment, the notion that is going to be put more and more that you're lucky to have a job, so accept whatever is on offer or whatever degrading of your conditions is being put forward. That is framing the reform debate that we're now heading into. And it's giving business groups and the coalition cover for more deregulation and erosion of workers' rights. And you see today the legislation extending JobKeeper with the proposal to give employers more powers to reduce the hours of work of employees, even where they don't qualify for JobKeeper. So this delinking of removal of Fair Work Act protections from the scheme itself is very troubling. So in this kind of environment, unions are really hard pressed to hold on to existing conditions. The employers are complaining, as they have been for a while, about complexity of awards. A lot of businesses, including in the university sector, are trying to freeze pay increases by varying their agreements. So actually coming back to the goal of unions to improve wages and conditions, that's really hard that gets a look in at the moment. I do see the post-COVID setting on balance as offering unions more potential to rebuild their strength and influence. But I think for that to happen, it's going to look very different from the past. And we've often looked, and generally we do look at, figures on union density as the measure of success. And, in the past we had over 50% union density in a very different world and a very different Australian economy. And I don't know that it's realistic that we'll get back to that. But I don't think that needs to be the measure either. A lot of unions have recognised that the traditional model of full fee membership structures just doesn't appeal to younger workers, to migrant workers, and to a lot of women. Key groups that unions have to attract if they're going to remain relevant. So, that gap is being filled by new innovative forms of what a union looks like. Hospo Voice, a digital alternative to union membership for $10 a month that gets you access to some support to combat wage theft, for example. That might end up leading to someone becoming a full traditional style union member. It might not, but I don't think that matters. I think what matters is that it's the union movement, or parts of it at least, saying, we recognise that you're looking for something different and we're going to provide it. There's a few other examples. The AWU has an offshoot called Hairstylists Australia. A group of workers, often sexual harassment is a major issue. Underpayment certainly is. So that's specifically for them. And even game workers, techie dudes, a lot of young, really smart people wouldn't even think about joining a union. The MEAA and Professionals Australia have worked together to provide them an option. And a lot of these options are very technology driven. And it's enabling workers to form different forms of attachment to a collective group that works for them. And I think that's really important. So coming back to the core union project, winning new gains for workers and building worker power. Well, we're going to be stuck with this Fair Work Act and its restrictive rules for bargaining and industrial action and limits on right of entry for a while. And at the same time, the Fair Work Commission that interprets and applies those laws is increasingly stacked with coalition appointments. So we can't rely on them to do anything. They'll interpret those laws, and they are, in important cases, in Capital's favour. For the first time this year, we had a dissenting decision in the annual wage increase case because they appointed an economist, a renowned right-oriented economist, Mark Wooden, to the panel, and he issued a dissenting decision saying there shouldn't be any pay rise at all this year. That's what we're up against. So I think in that kind of environment, unions have got to mix their strategies up. Strikes and other forms of collective action, absolutely. But innovative tactics, street protests, social media campaigns, consumer boycotts, some of those have been used really effectively in the ETU's picket at the CUB Abbotsford Brewery back in 2016, where they were outsourcing and maintenance workers were going to have to apply for their own jobs at 65% less pay. Really clever campaign on Facebook, boycotting VB and other products, signing up some of the pubs across Melbourne to get behind that boycott, and it worked. There's been a few other examples. And then there's been other successes where traditional strike action has played a much more important role. So last year, the NUW, as it then was before the amalgamation, was negotiating a new agreement at Chemist Warehouse, where the major issue was labour hire. You know, in the distribution centres for Chemist Warehouse, they were using around 70% of the staff from various labour hire agencies. And so the protected industrial action for that new agreement by the NUW over a number of days, and stocks were drying up, and there was a bit of a backlash about, preventing important medical stock from getting to the shelves. Had the effect, and in that agreement, they got conversion of casual labour hire workers to permanent roles. Now, when the same issue arose out at the Amazon so-called fulfilment centre out at Dandenong around the same time early last year, where they were using 100% labour hire staff, the NUW and other unions there, they didn't, because they were all labour hire, there was really no inroad for union organisation or industrial action. So they went the media strategy. And I don't know if people saw, but there were a series of articles in The Age and The Guardian that really highlighted the oppressive working conditions, the metrics and monitoring and performance targets that these workers are subjected to. And it led to a shift. The company came out and said, okay, well, we'll make 500 of these roles permanent roles. I don't know if they've done that yet, but that was certainly what was agreed to. So what I'm getting at is that there need to be a mix of tactics, the traditional and the new and innovative working together. And this has also been used in relation to the gig economy. The problem of the platforms who have the food delivery riders riding around and try and tell us that that's an independent business, that's a contractor, therefore not covered by an award. Utter nonsense. But there's been a number of unions having a real go at trying to represent these workers. It's really tough because they're physically dispersed. There's no workplace that Uber drivers come to, for example. Different mix of tactics and strategies. Legal challenges, a few of those have been successful. Upending the notion that these workers are contractors, establishing employment rights in a number of cases, campaigning for law reform and policy change. And again, Trades Hall's been right in the middle of this through the Young Workers Centre, working with the TWU on their Rights for Riders campaign. And then some unions have even tried to engage in a type of collective bargaining with the platforms. Unions New South Wales did an agreement with Airtasker a few years ago. It's not great, as in it doesn't look like a typical industrial collective agreement. They put up recommended pay rates that matched the award on their site, and there was some attention paid to some of the safety issues as well. Recently, the TWU did an agreement with a new food delivery app called DoorDash, which is a shocker over in the United States, but surprisingly here was at least willing to talk to the union. And they got some really good outcomes around safety protections in COVID and a commitment to an ongoing dialogue. So I think what these examples are showing is that the importance of unions at least trying to make inroads in representing workers in these incredibly difficult areas of the new economy, where the business models that have been created have deliberately been put there to keep unions out. They absolutely have to do this, and it's good to see that in some areas there are some pockets of success in them doing it. I think one other really important point about what the role of unions actually is, and this comes from a great article by Professor Keith Ewing from the UK, which looked at the functions of trade unions from 2005. I mean, we know the traditional functions, the bargaining function, the workplace representation role, the representing of members in individual disputes, the service function has become increasingly important. But he talks also about the regulatory function. So the role of unions in engaging with government to obtain laws that assist workers and that help unions to do their work. And I think some of the recent examples in Victoria that illustrates the potential utility of this, the campaigns that have gone into labour hire licensing laws to get rid of dodgy labour contractors who exploit people in labour hire. Wage theft is now a crime in Victoria thanks to a concerted trades hall and other union campaign. And industrial manslaughter. These are massive social reforms that the union movement can say hand on heart, we claim that because it wouldn't have happened without us. They can also claim JobKeeper because it wouldn't have happened without a massive union campaign. So I think there are a range of ways in which union strength, vitality can be rebuilt, as Jelle Visser argues. The revitalisation path is the one we have to aim for. But I think it's also requires, and I'll finish on this, a bit of a change of mindset within unions too. So much of it traditionally has been about how many members can we sign up? And clearly that is important. Membership equals income, equals the ability to keep going. But I think it's also got to be, as a starting point, about the critical mass that you can engage in a campaign, whether that's about the safety of the work site, the loss of jobs from restructuring, protecting workers from pay cuts, winning a pay increase. The UWU recently proved that it's possible in a pandemic when they were locked out. Some of their workers at a Woolworths DC in Wyong a couple of weeks ago were locked out, but they ended up winning that dispute and getting a pretty good pay increase in an environment of pay freezes. And it's really from those successes that you build more sustained and an ongoing collective force for change. So I'll leave it there and assume we'll move into questions and discussion. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Anthony. That was extremely interesting. And I'm glad that we can now say we've got two optimists speaking to us tonight. And I'm going to go for your revitalisation option as the one that obviously we all hope is going to be the one that's going to happen. And I think all those sort of innovative ways that you've described that unions and the progressive movement generally can be successful in these extremely difficult sort of position of weakness that we're in, that we're having to fight our way out of, is really interesting and really, can give us hope, I think, and encouragement. So thank you very much for that. So we're now going to move on to the question and answer. I'd like to remind everyone that if you'd like to ask a question, put something into the chat and we'll pick things out. We've got a number of questions in there already, and keep that coming. This is also the point where I'd like to remind you that if you are finding this rewarding, and if you are finding this is an evening where we're developing ideas that can help and inspire the progressive movement, and which obviously includes all of us on this call, then please, if you're not already a member of Fabians, do join us and strengthen our movement. So I will, I'll pick out some questions that we've had over the course, and I'm going to go first to Hamish McPherson, who's actually asked a number of questions and comments as the thing has unfolded. So some of your questions, Hamish, might have ended up being answered by the speakers as they spoke, but I'm just going to throw to you if you can unmute yourself, or if the host can unmute you, I invite you to ask a question or make a comment.
Thank you, and thanks to both speakers for really relevant and informative contributions tonight. I suppose I'm a teacher and a member of the Australian Education Union in Benalla and a delegate at my school, and I suppose I've been involved in the campaigns against work choices, and you know, my colleagues at my primary school back in Melbourne, we stopped work twice to oppose work choices. The outcome with Fair Work Act, though, has been disappointing in not really delivering the full, I suppose, democratic rights for workers to organise and take action. So I guess my question was around, obviously we do work in a situation of very limited legal rights for unions. And I'm interested in how obviously it, at some point, you know, everything's stacked against us. So at what point do we develop strategies which look to actually challenge some of those legal limitations in practice? Because I think that the longer that that we accept all the different regulations that are placed on us, the more confident the employers get, and the harder. So I'm just, you know, obviously there were some real high points in the late 1960s, the Claret-O'Shea dispute, where a range of unions did take concerted action to challenge laws in practice. And I'm wondering whether it might be time to start looking at that, yeah, to actually rebuild our power.
I take it, Hamish, by challenge, you mean go around them, disobey them rather than challenge them legally?
Yeah, that's right, in practice. Yeah, to in practice take action. I mean, I know that some of the, you know, the big stop work actions that happened against the work choices laws were, there was national industrial action called at that time. That was, you know, in my understanding, is in breach of the strict letter of the law. But when the unions called, you know, that sort of mass action, it was effective. Yeah, also when, yeah, so I guess facts on the ground, some of the recent stoppages around workers' health and safety, you know, workers actually just deciding we're going to take this action, we're going to walk off the job to protect our safety during the pandemic. Again, might not abide by the strict letter of the law, but it's clearly got the weight of moral authority on its side. So I just think, yeah, it's time to start to reconsider how we push back on that, and also the role of workers themselves taking action. I know there was a big meeting of about 450 higher education workers in the last week, like a rank and file network, who are looking to coordinate, you know, strong action against job cuts there. If the laws are going to, yeah, bind us, we need to look at possibly the role of workers themselves organising and taking democratic decisions on the job and taking action.
Yeah, well, look, I think particularly in this moment, with everything that's happening, I think this all really does need to be explored. And if not going out very deliberately knowing that you're in breach of the law, at least being prepared wing it and push up against the limits. So the thing about, as you said, the safety disputes, like in the spotless laundry and the distribution centres, I mean, there is a possible legal argument that the industrial action is lawful, because under the Act, if it's based on a legitimate concern about a risk of health and safety, it ceases to be industrial action, therefore can't be unlawful. So there's a lot of complicated legal argument there. But I think going in with the attitude of what you're saying, which I think is what the union and those workers did, which is we need to do it and we'll work out later if it's legal or not. And so with Spotless, the employer went straight away to the Fair Work Commission for an order saying it was unlawful industrial action, and the union ended up overturning that, because once the DHS inspector was appointed, they closed the site down, so that the strategy worked. And I think that shows that there has to be an exploration of the limits of what's possible, maybe even beyond what's legally possible. And the example you also mentioned about the unis at the moment, I think is another really good example. I have seen that stuff about the informal grouping. I haven't jumped on board myself yet, but we've got a big issue in higher ed with our union, the NTU, having gone out very early with a jobs protection framework that a lot of members were very unhappy about, and the Vice-Chancellors walked away from anyway. And now we have, different unis picking off members to try and roll through pay cuts and redundancies. So the potential for unlawful, unprotected action to protest that and protest what the federal government's doing around fees at the moment, I think it's perfectly legitimate to explore that. I don't know what you think, Carina.
You need to unmute, Carina. You're muted. Can someone unmute Carina?
Thank you so much. Yes, sorry, I can't unmute myself.
No, sorry about that.
I'm probably of the ask for forgiveness, not permission school of doing things. So look, and I think really, like, at its heart, like, unions are democratic structures. So whether that's at a workplace level or a branch level or a national level, like, that's how unions operate. So I think, if workers determine that the best course of action is to, walk off the job to protect health and safety, or for whatever reason, then that's a decision for the workers on that site, ultimately. And as I was mentioned in the introduction, I used to work at the NUW, which is now the United Workers Union, and so I have some familiarity with some of the distribution centres that have taken action recently for health and safety. And it's no coincidence that they are very high density sites with a very strong delegate structure, very experienced, skilled delegates, very experienced, skilled HSRs on site, who, yes, work with their organisers and work with other parts of the union, but are also able to exercise their power every single day in those workplaces without, the institution of the union, if you want to think of it that way, with, officials coming in because, they've built these structures themselves on those work sites. So I think that does give you a certain level of power that you're then able to, exercise, and, that people can make those democratic decisions around protecting the work site and making sure people are safe, healthy, respected.
Sorry about that, I was muted, yeah. Thanks very much, Carina. The next person I'm going to invite to speak is Tim Diamond, who has a question about engaging with workers and about membership. So, Tim, can someone unmute Tim? And can he ask his question? Tim Diamond. Tim Diamond there? No.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, yep. Go for it, Tim.
Look, okay. So yeah, look, thank you. I'll try to be quick, and to some extent, I think Anthony's already partially answered the question. It was just more about unions often approach the workforce with the assumption that the normal job is the permanent full-time worker with the sort of horny-handed son of toil cloth cap. And insofar as the labour market doesn't look like that, we judge it to be somehow wrong. And therefore, sort of what we need to do is kind of put in policies that make the labour market produce more of the sort of workers that we think ought to exist. So permanent full-time work and all of those sorts of things. And I'm just wondering whether unions really ought to be sort of starting from, if you like, the workforce and the labour market as it is, recognising that not everybody does in fact want to be a permanent full-time worker. And some of our ideas about what constitutes job security might not suit everybody. And sort of basically, how do unions become a bit more sort of agile in the management parlance and a bit more adaptable to the workforce as it actually is? End question.
Do you want to have a go, Carina?
Sure. All right. So yeah, sorry, a bit awkward there, not knowing who was going to jump in first. Look, I don't think it's about imposing a particular model of work on workers, but it's actually about engaging workers around, like, how would you like to work, and creating the conditions where workers actually have a meaningful say around what that looks like. So, you know, unfortunately, I think we've often equated flexibility, for instance, with insecurity and, you know, a degradation of rights and, you know, not a very good kind of sense of workplace security and a whole range of other benefits that I think we might have, you know, traditionally attached to work. But you can have flexible work that actually works for workers and that is secure and that accommodates caring responsibilities, for instance. It's just that I think it is, unfortunately, not what employers think about when they think about these terms like flexibility. So when we're having these conversations, you know, unions on one side, employers on another, that's not the common understanding. You know, I think that there are a range of things that we should be potentially thinking about that don't resemble a nostalgic version of work, like shorter working weeks, for instance. You know, more support for people who take on caring responsibilities. You know, ways that we can think of, I guess, of imagining different structures and patterns of work. But I think that really, and this might just be from my own experience, like, really, secure jobs really do matter to people. Like having a safety net of sick leave, of annual leave, of knowing that you've got a regular paycheck coming in that helps you to budget, to make decisions about your life, to plan your weekends, to make that commitment to be part of the local community, whether it's through the footy club or, you know, through some other community group. Like those things, you know, really matter to people. And I remember, you know, being involved in surveying workers around these things in a few different instances over the years. I think we do need to think about different ways of making work for people, and that might look like, you know, non-standard employment arrangements, I guess, and more flexibility. But I think that needs to be determined by workers through stronger democratic processes, through bargaining, through people feeling like that they can approach their employers with their unions and make those kinds of requests, and that not mean that their jobs are going to be undermined. But I think, yeah, broadly, like we should think about what the future of work looks like in a way that, you know, maybe gives workers more time away from work, gives people more leisure time. Yeah.
And look, just briefly in response to that question, I think it's about a union going to the particular group of workers that is in question, being able to mix up what the offering is depending on what that group of workers looks like. So if you take something like the TWU, you know, traditional truck drivers union, covered a lot of people at the airport, range of other areas, but going to or trying to make inroads into food delivery riders, you know, much younger, much more diverse than their traditional membership. And the starting proposition of what they offer has to be, well, first thing on your list, we will help overturn the treatment of you as a contractor that locks you out of employment protections. That's number one. That's what we'll do. We'll bring legal cases until we overturn that. And from that, a whole lot of rights will follow. And then, you know, we will look at safety, because we know that a lot of you are uninsured, and that's part of the deal that gets imposed on you. So what I'm saying is, I think within each union, of the established unions, the proposition they're putting in front of different groups of workers needs to look different. And I think in some unions that's good, it does, and in some, unfortunately, they're probably a bit more wedded to their traditional cookie cutter, this is our deal, do you want to sign up kind of model.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Thanks very much. So we had a rather interesting question just come in from Ken Pat Ritt, talking about working from home and how does that change things. So I don't know if it's Ken or Pat, but whichever it is, can we unmute them and can we have the question?
Ken. It's Ken, and
Right.
That's my question. Working from home is a really flexible way of working, but it does require the employer to trust their employees. The question is, how do we organise such a dispersed workforce into a union? Because we can't have an on-site meeting because everyone's at home.
Well, I'll say something briefly, and then I think I'll leave it to Carina, because she's in the organisation that's actually trying to do this, and I might say doing it pretty damn well. I think what the pandemic is showing, well, you know, in higher education, to the extent we weren't already teaching online, we quickly had to pivot to that. In my area, in law at RMIT, we were already doing it online, so it was a pretty easy thing to do. In terms of a union reaching people at home, in a lot of ways, I think it's easier. I think what I've noticed in a number of organisations I'm involved in is that the uptake, you know, in this event tonight, the uptake of people participating in things because it's a lot more convenient to just jump onto a Zoom than trekking into the city to a meeting. I think there are ways in which it's easier. There are clearly ways that are inherent in your question that it's harder, because you do miss out on a lot in terms of the personal interactions, the dynamics, all that sort of thing. But I might leave it to Carina to fill us in a bit more on what Trades Hall's actually been doing.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I mean, I think that's right. Like, so I think, you know, what we should all be aiming to do as organisers in unions or wherever we are, is to find, you know, meet workers where they are. And at the moment, that's at home. And that's often, you know, the virtual space is a really great way to be able to connect with people. So when the pandemic really, you know, first kicked in, we could see very quickly that there was a need for a wage subsidy in Australia. And, you know, looking to some of the international examples, we organised a day-long online picket line, a virtual picket line, where we invited people to join with us just via this technology that we're on now, via Zoom, streamed live to Facebook, to do a number of different activities. So call into Talkback Radio, to tweet around the issue of needing a wage subsidy, to call Liberal MPs and senators' offices, to share petitions, and, you know, to try and make meetings to speak to their local representatives in Parliament. And that was really effective because people felt like they could take action where they were in a way that maybe they wouldn't have been able to take action in other ways. And, you know, that was successful in really making sure that the issue got to the people it needed to. I mean, we had a lot of coverage in the media that day that brought a lot of momentum for a parliamentary sitting week for the union movement to really mount a strong case, and saw that ALP, for instance, being able to talk about those issues, and the Greens as well, and crossbenchers, because they knew that there was such a strong community sentiment around them. And that was all possible because it was actually easier in that particular scenario to connect with people at home, and for people to sort of jump in and out of taking action in ways it might not have been possible if this was a physical action. In joining people too, I think that there is a really heightened feeling around needing to protect your job right now, and around you know, wanting to be part of a collective right now. So union membership overall has risen a bit, and we've certainly found through work in the Young Workers Centre and that job scammer website that I mentioned before, we've had hundreds of young people contact us there who'd never had a union experience before, sometimes because they were in really small workplaces where it was just not known to the union, or they'd been working from home, and so had never, you know, been in a lunchroom already as it was, and now they've all been able to be part of you know, unions, which is really great, and that spans industries from retail to hospitality to you know, people working as engineers, to people working in the media. So that's really encouraging. I think that as we move out of this public health crisis, there'll be probably more people that want to continue to work from home. And so we'll have to think about what strategies will work best to contact people in those scenarios. You know, and one of the challenges there too is we've seen a couple of pretty bad cases where you know, people are working from home and their employers are finding new ways to exercise workplace surveillance. So, you know, we're all on Zoom right now. We've heard cases where workers are being asked to have Zoom on all day so that their boss can just check in on them, you know, while they're doing their work. So I think there'll be those, unfortunately, there'll be those opportunities where we're reaching people precisely on the issue of working from home and the particular challenges that emerge as we go through this. And I think it's something that we really need to, as a movement, think about, because this is clearly, I think, going to be a feature of the future of work, and particularly in feminised industries too. And we need to think about how we work with people who are trying to balance out caring responsibilities, which are still overwhelmingly performed by women, with their responsibilities at work. Like, where is the boundary? Like, where does the workplace begin and end? So I think there's going to be a whole bunch of questions that are thrown up as a result of this experience that we need to think about how we answer.
Thanks very much, both of you. So I think both our questioners and our speakers are really pushing the boundaries at the moment, taking us into a lot of really, really interesting areas. And in the spirit of that, we have a question from Chris Gassin, who's also, I think, going to suggest an interesting thought as well. Chris, can Chris be unmuted and speak? Chris Gassin. So it just takes a while for Chris, for each one to be found and unmuted.
I'm unmuted now, yep. So I was asking about, so essentially with a lot of talk about the gig economy and I guess different natures of employment, it becomes very hard for unions to, I guess, represent workers when there's no, I guess, employer concerned in many cases, since people are, you know, sole traders essentially in these industries. Are other forms of, I guess, worker organisation useful at looking at for these? And I'm thinking more of a guild system, whereas, or maybe something to do with cooperative ownership of these types of enterprises.
I'm not that across co-ops, and you know, guilds I knew were the forerunners to unions, because unionisation was formed around the craft back in the old days in England. One thing I do know that might partly answer your question is that the issue of there not being a workplace, you know, which is a massive one for the platform economy. I know that there's been a lot of sort of organic growth of collective groups, particularly in Italy, around food delivery riders. So in a lot of the northern Italian cities, you know, those beautiful cities, in the centre of them, like in Milan and Turin, where the food delivery riders just sort of hang out. That's how some of their informal rider collectives have begun, because they'd hang out and, you know, have a whinge to each other about how shit the conditions were. And then they'd sort of start talking about, well, what are we going to do about it? And there's a bit of literature coming out now documenting and compiling the effectiveness of this. You know, they do organised ride-throughs of these centres of town, of these towns with, you know, these colourful flags, and they are not a formal labour organisation. They are informal, spontaneous groups of collectives who pull the pin on the app for a few hours and rip through the town and get a lot of media coverage, and then get a seat at the table in discussions with Fedora or whichever one it is, and you know, generally get some kind of improvement. I mean, that's unionism to me. It's just not being done in the traditional way that we've all understood. But and the other part of the point I'm making is that where unions aren't there or aren't able to meet these challenges, a lot of workers are just doing it themselves anyway. There's some media today about over in the US, a group of Target workers forming their own union. And we've had that happen here in Australia with the Retail and Fast Food Workers Union, because workers were unhappy about what their mainstream union, the SDA, was doing. So look, I might have gone a bit off track from your question, Chris, but I don't know, Carina, if you've got any thoughts on cooperatives or other structures.
Well, I think cooperatives generally a great idea, and I mean, there's lots of examples I think of, yeah, with the gig economy where there've been, you know, people setting up cooperatives there. I guess I've recently, I don't know, been sort of really thinking existentially around the gig economy and the nature of it, in terms of, you know, these operators come into a state and they kind of have this platform set up ready to go, and we're always just playing catch up. And so I think that we don't want to have any kind of system that's set up necessarily just kind of to cater to, you know, like the innovative, like, search for loopholes by, you know, really rogue operators. So really, I think, you know, we don't want to adapt to bad actors. We want those bad actors to become good actors, because we're setting up the and worker democracies and requirements to have worker democracies that mean that you know, we're not always just being reactive. So you know, I think if workers decide that they want to, you know, start a cooperative platform, then that's great. You know, but I think it kind of goes back to what is the problem we're trying to solve here? Is the problem we're trying to solve is we've got a lot of like really like terrible operators, and there's food delivery, but there's also like if you haven't looked at care.com yet, and you want to have a pretty like confronting evening, I recommend you do so, because this is a platform that is really set up for care workers to pitch their own rates. And so some of them, it's like these people wanting to work in aged and disability care in homes for $9 an hour. Pretty confronting stuff. You know, are these the kinds of platforms, are these the kinds of ways of models of employment that we even want? So I think it kind of goes back to that question too. Co-ops are good because it gives workers agency in ways that they don't currently have that, and they're democratic by nature. You know, do they guarantee things like a living wage to workers? You know, is this the best way for care work, for you know, various kinds of contract work and food delivery to operate? I don't know if it is. So yeah, look, apologies for getting, you know, sort of taking us back a little bit, but it's been just something I've been thinking about recently, is sort of, you know, why and how have these platforms kind of been given permission to operate? And, you know, that puts us in a position where we're all always trying to play catch up. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much to Carina and to both of you on your answers on that one. I'm going to invite Matthew Coote to ask a question about trade unions and the ALP. If Matthew, we can unmute Matthew. There's a question on that. Just takes a moment to find someone and unmute them. Hopefully Matthew's voice will come through shortly. Is Matthew there?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to ask a question from this angle, and that is, how can the unions improve their engagement with their ALP? We often hear about the ALP's relationship with the unions, but I'm just thinking the other way, because I've met a number of union members over the years who don't support the ALP. And from my way of thinking, that, you know, politics in Australia favours the two major political parties. So of the two major parties, it's the ALP that's far better, committed to far better industrial relations legislation. And you're talking, Carina just raised that example about the .care site. I believe the ALP would be the one that would be more likely to regulate the gig economy, to deal with such an issue. So I'm just wondering what the speakers think about how the unions can improve their engagement with the ALP and encourage members to engage with the ALP.
Well, I suppose full disclosure, I'm both a union member and a member of the ALP. However, not every union is an affiliate to the Labor Party. So I think that's the first thing there, is that, you know, I think they are, again, you know, the relationship to political parties from a union perspective is a decision that is democratic and for every union to make for itself. I guess, you know, unions have a very particular view, and I personally have a very particular view of the Labor Party, which is that this is an organ in sort of the Parliament that was set up to advance union members' interests, you know, in the various sort of states in Australia. And I mean, even if you go back to the very earliest iterations of the Labor Party in Victoria, there were criticisms around the party and the union movement not necessarily always being in sync. So I think that there is this sort of nostalgic idea that, you know, 100 years ago, you know, the Labor Party and the union movement were as one, and I don't think that's ever been the case. And I'm someone who thinks that it's good sometimes to have a bit of healthy tension, because, you know, we don't necessarily want political expedience and parliamentary expedience to get in the way of decisions that workers make in their individual workplaces, for instance. However, you know, I think there's probably more in common with the ALP, certainly in the Victorian platform, and workers than there is, you know, difference. But again, I don't think any political party should take either institutional union support for granted or individual union members' support for granted, because, you know, union members don't just vote on one thing. And, you know, as I was sort of speaking about before, union members don't just vote on industrial issues and industrial rights. They vote on a range of different things, really around generally what they think will make the community stronger. And so how we bring people along on that journey to recognise a particular party or another is more aligned to their views. You know, this is probably maybe not the most popular answer, but that is really the work of the political party to try and make that case, rather than the union to try and, I guess, encourage support of a party without, I guess, certain benchmarks being met around what are the really deeply and widely felt issues for that membership.
Yeah, well, I'm someone who's a union member and a former member of the ALP, was very, very deeply involved quite a long time ago. And I think I saw a bit too much of the ugly side that sort of put me off a bit. And it also was around when I was going into academia. So look, I think it's a necessary relationship. It's not without its risks for the union side of that relationship. I think the problematic side of it is when it's too much linked with the factions within both unions and the ALP, and the game is a political game and it's about pre-selection of our people, that kind of thing. That's part of what put me off it, to be honest. The really positive and essential side of it is the policy formulation side, and the ways in which unions know so much about what the problems are for working people and the inequalities in society, and are able to take that to the better ALP politicians, federal and state, and have them listen and have them work together on policy solutions. And I mentioned a few where that's worked really well in Victoria. I think that Trades Hall and a number of the stronger unions, you know, getting things like industrial manslaughter just so important. So I think, I don't know I have an answer about how it can be improved for individual members of either unions or the ALP. But I think it's a very important relationship that needs to continue, as long as its better elements are more on display publicly. Because my problem, I think, that damages the union movement is that from time to time it's the ugly stuff that gets a lot of the attention.
Thanks, Anthony. So we've got a question, I think maybe we'll make this the last one, from Sarah Howe. But I think it's going to be about the Change the Rules campaign. So can Sarah be unmuted? And again, we just have to be patient while that happens, and we'll soon hear Sarah's voice, I hope.
Okay, thanks for that. I just want to pick up on that point by Anthony. Thanks for 2 terrific presentations. They were fantastic and great to get your insights, both of you, from a practitioner and academic perspective on where we're going. I just want to pick up on that point though by you, Anthony, and my question kind of ties into Matt Coote's question really around, I mean, the Labor Party has 60% of the vote on conference floor is from the unions. And my big beef over the years has been, why don't they use it more to kind of leverage a kind of a strategy around sort of re-regulation of the labour market in a way? And I know what you're saying about we've got all these new business models, but I mean, the Brereton Reform Act in 1997, when I was a union organiser back in the day, started the process of enterprise flexibility agreements and enterprise bargaining. And me and others fought our guts out on the floor of workplaces across the service sector to try and desperately re-regulate at the level of the enterprise. And it's hopeless, you know. I mean, you know, this kind of American model of consumer boycotts and protests out the front of workplaces, I mean, that's just defeatism. We need to be going back to the Labor Party and saying, no, you know, we made a mistake. Okay, we need to re-regulate the labour floor. And if that means a really complicated new act, we're all going to be part of that negotiation with Albanese behind the scenes to organise that in the next kind of couple of years before the next election. I mean, this is what Sally McManus was trying to do with the Change the Rules campaign. She was trying to, that was a sort of the slogan for re-regulation. And suddenly we've gone back to the American model, you know, of, oh, it's all hopeless, we can't get there. The Liberals are in, so we're just going to protest about, you know, and try and mop up, you know, safety net problems around the edges through some sort of conflict American model, which is, you know, it's a disaster. I mean, we've got an airline industry that's collapsed. We have no manufacturing industry. We need to re-regulate the labour floor. We need to bring back an comprehensive industry policy, which is absolutely going to provide substantial new jobs in the middle, in the skilled middle of the labour market, which has disappeared under our watch, mind you, with the button plans. And I think you know, I mean, we've just got to stop abrogating responsibility. We need to be a part of the, you know, the discussion in the next couple of years around what we're going to do. To try and change the situation and not just have this sort of defeatist defensive strategy. That's all. Sorry, that turned into a speech. I don't know where the question is in that. Sorry.
Just respond. Our speakers respond to that as they see fit. Thanks, Sarah.
Sorry about that.
Great. No,
it's a bit passionate. Sorry.
Yeah, that's what we need. Passion.
I'm a Fabian. I'll put myself on mute.
I know I didn't talk about it a lot, but I don't think I'm saying give up on the institutional framework. It has to be improved. I suppose the worry I had about Change the Rules, I mean, I supported it, agree with it. It's a complicated, the way it was constructed was a complicated argument. Oh, you're arguing against a law that Labor introduced that the unions helped write. And I know that's a very simplified version of it, but I think the complexity and the way it was put didn't help it. Like, what was it actually against? And I think there was a banking on a repeat of your rights at work. And it didn't quite work that way because the connection to people's individual circumstances weren't made clear enough. But anyway, I said, I don't know if anyone read it, but it was in my blog, the week after the election, ACTU, go hard, keep going. But tell us more about why we need these changes and tell us more about what the changes would be. And I know that they deliberately went small target. They didn't want to release detailed statutory proposals. That's fine in the lead up to an election. But the way I thought about it after the election was we've got 3 years to actually really develop this case. And I'm all for being part of helping to do that. I'm actually doing some work with one of the unions at the moment on one of the key claims. Well, you know, enterprise bargaining is buggered. You can't bargain enterprise by enterprise. You've got to be able to bargain with the supermarket at the head of the supply chain, or with the franchisor, or the bloody labour hire host who doesn't want to talk to you because the labour hire company employs the people. So what does sectoral bargaining or supply chain bargaining actually look like? Are there models overseas we can draw on? So I'm all for, we've got to fill in that detail. The last thing I would say is I don't think what you've said about going the American model. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there are examples all around the world of workers themselves coming up with new forms of representation that fill the gap, that I think, you know, we are emulating some of that with some of the work that Young Workers Centre, Migrant Workers Centre and others are doing, Hospo Voice. It's not one or the other. These are all important contributions to rebuilding collective power.
And yeah, just on that point too, Anthony, like I think it's, yeah, like workers will exercise power where they think they have it. And so if that is around protesting and if that is around, you know, consumer boycotts, for instance, then I think that should be supported. Sarah, I really loved your contribution, your question. I do think that, yeah, we need to continue to go hard. And I think that there are so many, unfortunately, so many examples of reasons why we need to make the kind of reforms that the Change the Rules campaign sought to. I think wage theft is a really great example. You know, we don't need to be arguing kind of the technicalities of, you know, right of entry laws, for instance, for unions. It's just like, well, you know, we've got a real problem in this country around wage theft. The federal government even acknowledged that. Imagine if we could just walk into a workplace and check the books and make sure people were being paid properly. That would help solve that problem. And I think that's a really simple way for people to understand, you know, the sorts of reforms we're talking about that ultimately give working people more power. And I think, yeah, we need to absolutely continue to go hard. This federal government, and I didn't get time to mention it because this is such a big topic and I could really, like, you know, talk all night around it. But Christian Porter is someone who I think is an extremely frightening figure, because he's been very good at positioning himself as the workers' friend around talking about the need for wage theft legislation at a federal level, talking about, you know, the need for a national labour hire licensing scheme. And all of those reforms will do in his hands will serve to undermine the state-based systems that are already in place, and as well as really dilute the influence of unions to do that kind of regulatory work that I think we need to keep being able to do. So I think Christian Porter is a particularly interesting figure in the federal government to look at, because he's someone who has appropriated a lot of the language of the movement and a lot of the way we talk about issues, and in fact the very issues themselves, and really diluted them and you know, defanged them to the extent that it's really around trying to make the union movement and the Labor Party irrelevant to the conversation. So yeah, he's very, very smart, and he's very, very dangerous.
Thanks very much, Carina. Thanks to both of you. So we'll close the Q&A there. So thanks for two extremely interesting speakers. I think you've really broadened our horizons in terms of this whole topic that we've posed to you tonight. And also thanks to our questioners and people that have commented. The chat itself is a pretty good resource as well. Lots of interesting ideas, lots of interesting discussion in there. So I think it's been a great discussion of such an important issue of how on earth do we get, you know, off the back foot, you know, and get back to as much as we can to the ordinary worker, having a bit of a, you know, having a bit more power to drive the way things go, which is what this series is about. So